Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the International Men's Movement Program, Episode 4. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever time it is where you are. For me, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. We're going to be talking about the country of France, and I'm Paul, of course, with ABFM, and also want to introduce right away my co-host here, Lucian Valsan, who is the multi-site operations director among several other hats he wears for a voice in. Hi, Lucian. How you doing tonight?
Hi there, everyone. I'm doing fine. The city has just woken up and things are looking quite great. I mean, for the first time in many days, it's not freezing as hell outside, so I guess that's great.
But you know, I know just how you feel, Lucian. I'm here in Houston, and I saw snow on TV the other day. It was really bad, man. I thought I was going to shovel myself out of my living room. Um, And there was another day 2 weeks ago where I almost had to wear a sweater. I want you to know this is rough. I think we probably need a movement behind that. Um, well, listen, we're going to be talking about France, and this is a. Let me just say to begin with, this is kind of an interesting subject. You know, there has been always this sort of, depending on who you talk to, you get a lot of different impressions about France and its people. If you talk to people who have visited Paris and maybe went to the wrong places, they come out saying that French people are kind of snotty and snooty. Other people I've talked to who have been through the French countryside said they were some of the warmest, most friendly people in the world. It is a country that is steeped in history in terms of what happened, especially during World War II. And you have some very interesting leaders, people like Charles de Gaulle. There's just a lot to talk about when you talk about France. But of course, we may get to some of that. But what I want to talk about is what we usually do. We talk about these things in terms of gender politics, of how the sexual politics play out in a country. And if you look in the low bar, you will find a story that we're linked to where a man in France was ordered to pay 9,000 euros for not fucking his wife while they were married. Let me repeat that, just so everybody knows that I didn't stutter or missay anything. He was ordered to pay his wife sued him apparently during the process of their divorce, saying he didn't dick me enough, so he had to cough up 9,000 euros. And of course, now, listen, that's a story that begs for about a million different punchlines. It does. I mean, you could make a lot of jokes out of that. But the first thing that entered my mind, Lucian, was so what if you get married in France and your wife starts eating 20 or 30 crepes a day and guzzling all the wine in the world? She puts on 250 pounds. She's 5'1". Pushing 350, develops skin conditions and doesn't bathe. Is it a situation there that if you don't tap that, you're going to end up shelling out in divorce court? So what's the deal with the story?
Well, most likely no. In such conditions that you described, that would be quite enough reason to divorce. But before explaining that verdict in that particular court, I need to say something about getting married in France, because it's a little bit more complicated than almost everywhere in Europe, really. Recently, A Voice for Men Romania and then A Voice for Men.com in English published a story by the editor-in-chief of AVFM Romania, Mariana Todiese, called Privatize Marriage. Well, France is probably the closest example at this point of having such thing in law, i.e. privatizing marriage privatization. That is to say, there was a moment when there was a harsh movement to force the French state to legalize gay marriage. Now, the problem is that in order to accomplish such thing in France and be consistent with the long legal tradition started in the French Revolution, that was a problem. The second problem was to get the harsh Catholic majority not to oppose too hard on such a project. So the politicians were in a very, very difficult position. I mean, they couldn't call up for a referendum because the proposition would lose hands down without any consideration. They couldn't just say, oh, well, as of today, France recognizes and allows gay marriages, because that would provoke even more street movements. So what they came up with was a sort of civil partnership. But unlike the civil partnerships in the United Kingdom, the law of civil partnerships in France is neutral. So essentially, it can be used by straight couples just as it can be used by gay couples. And right from the moment that that particular piece of legislation was introduced, a significant portion and a growing portion of new marriages in France are legalized using that law of civil partnership instead of the law of marriage that has been existing, of course, since forever in the French legislation. And that creates quite a dissonance within the French judiciary. Because whenever a politician wants to do something to help women and children, because just like everywhere else in France, most politicians are gynocentric, they have to amend the marriage law. They can't amend the civil partnership law. So essentially, the people who got caught in the old law, which is still enforced today, get to have the short end of the stick. And when I say the people caught, I mean the men caught in there, because there's very rare cases when women get the short end of the stick. Last story I read in France where a woman got the short end of the stick, she had to pay, can you imagine? She had to pay 4 years of maintenance to her former husband after 20 years of marriage. That was the worst case I was able to find, and it happened in 2008. So it's been like 7 years since then. But other than that, there's very rare cases when women get the short end of the stick. But I'm all for acknowledging even those. But most of the younger people are under the new law of civil partnership, and the main advantage of the civil partnership is that you can dissolve marriage far easier, especially when children aren't involved. So if this couple were to have been married under the civil partnership law, that kind of verdict just couldn't exist, period. Most likely they were married under the old law. Now, going to the judicial tradition. Well, the legal tradition of France is quite similar to the one in my own country, which says that the civil rights, i.e. the positive rights, not the negative rights, as the U.S. Citizens will probably understand them. No. In France, there's a long tradition of positive rights, i.e. you get rights at the expense of someone else. That is the positive rights for you. In the long tradition of positive rights and in the long tradition of protecting women and children, you can actually require compensation for either not getting enough sex or not getting enough housework or all kinds of stupidities like this. Now, granted, most judges will just laugh it off the courtroom, but you know, sometimes some judges will say, well, that's a fair point, so therefore I'm ruling you have to pay what is 9,000 euros because you haven't dicked your wife enough.
Let me interrupt and get you to clarify for a moment, because as you're explaining this, these really sound a lot more like elements of contract law, which I would have expected under civil partnership rather than the marital contract.
In the marital contract, there is no such thing as the law to get enough sex. However, in any civil code country as opposed to a common law country. So common law countries are US, Canada, UK, India, South Africa, Australia, and a few others. And the rest of the planet works under the civil code type of fundamental legislation, which is significantly or radically different in the sense that it is based on the judicial tradition and the state's tradition as opposed to the common bottom-up tradition, as it's the case with the common law. So in the marital contract of France, definitely the right to get enough sex doesn't exist. But because the divorces are being judged according to the judicial tradition, as opposed to what is actually said in the marital law, that means some of those rights can be added on the spot by a snappy judge. And in a civil law country, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, obviously, it is something wrong with it, but legally speaking, it's not really so unheard of. And if you get such a snappy judge, you're going to have quite a time to overturn such a ruling. Now, it is possible to overturn it, but it requires several years or sometimes close to a decade to overturn.
I'm guessing in the meantime, you probably have to pay.
Yes and no. I mean, if you're sure enough that the decision was insane, you can just not pay it. And yes, the state will say, oh, and then now you owe interest to that amount or whatnot. But if you eventually get it overturned, then you don't have to pay anything. So no, you don't necessarily. You must not pay it. But well, it would be a good idea to start paying some of it. So yeah. Essentially, that guy's bad luck was that he was trapped in a marital contract instead of a civil partnership, and he had the misfortune of getting a very, very snappy judge. I've looked at that guy's case, and I was unable to see if he filed any appeal with a superior court. I don't know if he did. But if I were in his shoes, I would definitely go straight up to the equivalent of the Supreme Court, that is the Court of Cassation in France, and I would try to get that overturned. And preventively, I would already file a case on the European Court of Human Rights, and that would definitely get overturned. I don't know if he did that, but if he did not, and somebody who knows him watches this show, should probably do it. That thing won't stick.
Now, let me step out on a limb here and say that I'm going to assume I haven't seen it, and I'm betting if I search for it, I won't find it. I'm going to assume that there's never been a ruling in France where a woman was penalized money for not spreading her legs.
I don't think such thing ever occurred. I won't say it never occurred, but I don't think it has. And one of the reasons I think that is because most judges, just like everywhere else, tend to be quite gynocentric. And you have to remember, France also has a long tradition of, they call it laïcité, which is essentially secularism, I guess, in English. And so they have that, and they also have the long tradition of not being quite friendly with what they perceive to be Muslim leanings. So essentially, if they were to fine a wife for not giving enough sex to his husband, the wider society would interpret it as a Muslim-oriented sentence. So that would get around condemnation in the society, probably including from anti-feminists. So I don't think that ever happened. I won't say it never happened, but I just don't see that happening in
well,
France.
There's a challenge to viewers out there. If you can dig up a case where a woman was had to pay up or put out, we'd sure like to know about it, because that'd be worth a whole nother program all in of itself. Now let me move on, Lucian. Last time we did one of these, we did it on Italy, and one of the things that came up, and I'd like to do this with each country, is to, based on your great knowledge of Europe, to get an idea, because Americans, Canadians, Australians all see modern gender politics through a particular lens. It's part of the media here. It's part of the cultural experience that we know about a lot of double standards and a lot of craziness. But there are are some countries where that stuff is either more pronounced, like we have in Sweden, or it's less pronounced, like we might have in Romania right now. So can you give us a little bit of a flavor for what the atmosphere is like in France between men and women, and the state of sexual politics there?
Well, in terms of atmosphere between men and women, I can say it is significantly less tense than what I've seen in the United Kingdom. Now, mind you, when it comes to the United Kingdom, it's been a while since I've been there, and I have vowed to never come back. And one of the reasons was that essentially most of the women I was able to meet there were just, gosh, unbearable. And I'm not joking with that. In France, on the other hand, things are significantly more relaxed, actually quite close to what I can see in this country, although I would add that there are more overtly sexual than they are in this country. That is to say, modesty as it pertains to sexual conquest is not something appreciated in France. Quite the opposite. Now that shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, anyone who's been watching French culture, even in the 70s or earlier, will know that this is not something. This is not news. This has been the case in France for quite some time. Now, to my luck, I know quite a lot about this because French culture was amongst the very few things outside of the Iron Curtain that were allowed in this country for some reason. Well, actually, I know the reason, but that's besides the point. So yeah, in this case, so in this regard, the relationships between men and women are generally less tense than what I was able to experience in the United Kingdom, or what I'm able to observe through the media in North America or Australia or even Japan. God damn it, they're just two different planets. I mean, if you want to compare the relationships between men and women, France versus Japan, France is a fucking paradise.
Well, yeah, they basically, a lot of men in Japan have just decided to ignore the fact that the women there even exist.
And in a way, I don't blame them. I mean, given what I've been able to read here and there, he might have a point. Anyway, Japan is a long story that would require 3 hours just to get the introduction.
Yeah.
So yeah, in this regard, the relationships between men and women are significantly better. Now, just like in the case of Italy, in France it's the same thing. In the countryside, things are significantly more normal or more commonsensical, whilst in the cities things are a bit more rough and a bit more how do I put it? I don't want to use the word modern. I would rather use the word semi-primitive or postmodern.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, same thing as far as I'm concerned. Now, I know many will disagree with that, but that's fine. I can live with disagreements. Actually, I feed with disagreements. So yeah. What I would notice as a significant difference is that as opposed to Italy, because you asked the question in comparison with Italy, as opposed to Italy, the youngsters, however, are exposed to a significantly bigger degree of misandric or gender ideologue-oriented propaganda than the youngsters in Italy. As opposed to Italy and France, the feminist influence is not only big and overt, but also long-standing. I mean, think about it like this: feminism in the Italian universities has been around for about 20 years, probably even less, just like here in Romania. However, in France, feminist influence in the academia has been around for 70 years. That is longer than the United States. I mean, think about it like this: Jean-Paul Sartre and his notorious Nazi pedophile partner Simone de Beauvoir were influencing the academia as early as 1930s. And the Second Sex was written somewhere right after the World War II. So France has a very, very long tradition of having such radical ideas being propagated throughout the academia. And obviously their intelligentsia also was significantly more Marxist influenced than it was probably anywhere else, in at least when it comes to places outside of the Iron Curtain. France was essentially the middleman during the Cold War, was capitalist enough to be friendly with the West and leftist enough to be friendly with the communist nations. So yeah.
Well, are you, I'm trying to wrap my head around everything you're saying here. Are you saying that just the basic French cultural ethos was one that sort of left the radical feminist ideas of the intelligentsia and academicians sort of to be in their own cliques, their own area, their own space, but it did not filter down into the population so much as it has, so for instance, in the United States?
Yes, yes, I am saying that. I mean, there's definitely feminist influence within the French culture, no doubt about that. But for the most part, and I'm going to use a left-wing term in this, it hasn't trickled down too much within the wider society. I mean, if you're going to go with the things like some very insane ideas such as gender is a social construct, that's something that you probably never hear outside of the Marxist intelligentsia and the very, very fancy middle class or upper middle class pricks in Paris. You'll probably never hear it anywhere else. You'll probably hear it within the University of Lyon, maybe in the University of Lille, but that's pretty much it. I mean, if you go in the southern France where people are busy making wine or making various other products, which they then sell at huge prices to Germany, and everyone lives better off from this trade. If you go there and talk about things like this, you probably get some very strange looks, as in, what the hell is that? I mean, because and it's also a language barrier. I mean, in France, there is this word which exists in English as well called genre, and genre applies to two things: a genre of movie, just like in English, and the genre in grammar, because the nouns also have a gender in France, just like they
Right.
have in Spanish and any other Latin language. That's what people understand when they hear the word genre. Same goes in my country as well. So when you go and say genre is a social construct, well, at best you'll get agreement in the sense, well, yeah, we've built grammar so we can get an understanding with each other better. So yeah, genre is a social construct. But when you go and say that, oh no, we're applying genre to people, that's where you lost most of the population. There's a no. So yeah, it hasn't trickled down that much. So most of the feminist influence comes rather, how do I put it in order not to sound too insane? Well, I'll say it comes mostly covert. That is to say, you have journalists who spout some feminist ideas, but they'll try to keep it as non-overt as possible, in the sense that they'll never use terminology from the feminist theory. They'll try to wrap it around to sound more like something that comes from the common folk. And that has had limited success, especially if compared to the United States. I mean, think about it like this: Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the IMF and the member of the Socialist Party, had more condemnation of his supposed deeds in the United States than he got in France. There was recently, just 5 days ago, a poll in France where 66% of the French people would still vote for Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and they say, oh, he probably, and that was a communist saying, a communist academician said, probably Dominique Strauss-Kahn would have been a better choice than François Hollande. At least he wouldn't have fucked up the economy that much. So that tells you quite a lot about the French culture. In the US, such an individual would never even dream to have a chance to get into presidency.
Right. Well, I've heard from a lot of different sources that the French people look at our sexual scandals here in the United States and they basically laugh their asses off at how absurd it all is for the media to focus on sex lives of politicians, whereas there in France that the
They don't
occasional
care.
dalliance is expected, and it's like not news for
Yes,
people there.
yes, because politicians are humans, and humans are flawed beings, and flawed beings sometimes commit mistakes. I mean, other than the nasty and totally unexpected divorce and the small scandals that have happened between Madame Carla Bruni and the former president Nicolas Sarkozy. That was a scandal even in France. But most of the others, well, not really. They were essentially the little news in the corner of the paper. Oh yeah, and the president is suspected to have cheated his wife. Oh yeah, and the president is suspected to have visited prostitutes in Switzerland and or something like that. Okay, so what?
And so nobody cares. So let me ask you this in terms of the media in France. Of course, as you know, in the United States and a lot of other parts of Canada, Australia, England, that there is a flurry of pro-feminist ad campaigns, public service announcements that literally saturate our media with women get paid 4 cents on the dollar to what men make. 5 out of every 4 women is raped and beaten by the time she graduates high school, if we let her graduate high school, because we're still not allowing women access to education. Is this a part of the media diet for France?
Yes, it is, but it depends on which media. Now, there was a time when we had a very nice individual in the IRC chat room who kept on collecting the news for me in France and would send them to me on the email. So I would have more news from France on the radio show. Lately, he hasn't sent any, so I would guess that either the feminists had stopped doing that much, and I can understand that it's been a period of vacations in France lately. Anyway, yes and no. I mean, the pay gap thing is repeated ad nauseum, probably even more than it is in the United States. But the argument for it is not overtly feminist, it's implicitly feminist. The argument for the pay gap is Marxist in nature. In the sense that the media in France, as opposed to the media in the United States, they don't hide their Marxist colors. They'll be quite honest. Look, I am a journalist, I am a Marxist, and I believe there is structural discrimination against women because, look, women are making only 86 euro cents per every euro that a man makes in this country, and I believe this is the capitalist oppressors, bourgeoisie, whatever, oppressing poor little French women. That's essentially the argument, and they don't see anything wrong with it. I mean, when I react with laughter to such an argument, they get surprised. I mean, why are you laughing? Well, because you're full of it. That would be a start. So yeah, so the pay gap thing is quite recurrent in the media, especially in the biggest media such as Le Monde or Le Figaro, the biggest newspapers in France. However, with the rape thing, no, not so much. I mean, compared with the CNN, there's probably, I'm pulling numbers out of my ass here, but it's probably 10 times less, as I would put it. I mean, yeah, there is the occasional culture de la viol or rape culture story in the mainstream media, but it's very rare, and usually the comments are, this is American bullshit. That isn't true here. And I don't think
hey, go France.
Yeah. So that thing is slightly less common, at least when it comes to the big media. Now, when we turn to the feminist-oriented media, such as Madame Le Figaro, that is essentially the women's section of the newspaper Le Figaro, now there is quite common. But when you look at the stats when it comes to readers of that section, you'll notice that half of them are people like me who go in and say, let's see what is the latest feminist stupidity in France, and the other half will actually buy that. But overall, the audience numbers of those particular sections of the media are quite small when you compare it with the rest of the media. So no, the rape culture thingy is slightly less common than it is in the English-speaking media. Now, ironically, the inherent anti-Americanism that characterizes French society is helpful in this regard, because for better or worse, they see this as American propaganda. Now, you and I both know that that's not true, but that's a different story. Most of a significant, I won't say most, but a significant portion of the society perceives it that way, perceives it as in, oh well, this is American propaganda, so it's safe to ignore it. So whilst the outcome is good, now definitely they ignore it for the wrong reasons, because there was recently a Swedish ideologue who wrote a column in a French newspaper, and it was dismissed as American propaganda. So yeah, that's why I'm saying it's not really legit. The reason.
That's okay. We've got our equivalent here of people that find communists under every bed.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So it's
So,
safe to say that there's not what you would call a cultural rape narrative that has taken storm over all of France the
no,
way that it has here in
not
the
yet.
U.S. and Canada.
Not yet. No.
Not yet, but
No.
they're working on it, I'm sure,
Yes. Yes. And
because there's money in that narrative.
absolutely, absolutely. Money is one of the big reasons. Now, I guess one of the reasons why it hasn't permeated yes, and mind you, this is conjecture. I don't have full evidence for that. But I would think the reasons why it hasn't trickled down too much is because, unlike Britain or mind you, even most of Sweden or even Spain, in France, most of the feminist propagators are actually true believers. I mean, yeah, sure, they would like to get some money out of their ideas, but they're actually true believers. They believe virtually everything they say, which I'm not sure is the case with many feminist ideologues in the United States. I know for a fact it's not the case with most of feminist ideologues in Hungary or in Spain. I mean, I actually got a feminist in Hungary to tell it to me straightforward. Well, I get a fuck ton of money in international grants. Of course, I'm going to do feminist activism. And when the money dries out, I'm going to crawl back into my little hole, and you'll never heard of me again. So yeah, but in France, most of the ideologues are true believers. They actually believe in it. So they'll try to influence and get more power than to get money. Thankfully for everyone else, they haven't realized that they have to get money in order to achieve power. But you know, money is the enemy of any Marxist, and so on and so forth.
It does not stop them from wanting to take it right out of the government coffers, though, which I find is the ultimate hypocrisy that we have here, because we know that in our feminist establishment in the United States, that so many of them are Marxist ideologues who are decry capitalism, decry money, push as hard as they can for redistribution of wealth, especially when they can redistribute it right into their own coffers. They're very good at that. But let me ask you this. Let's move on to marriage law, family courts, that sort of thing in France. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are like? We obviously, in many parts of the U.S. and Canada and other countries, we have very acrimonious court systems that feed off of basically sponging the money out of what's left out of the marriage to line the pockets of lawyers, so they create as much conflict as possible. And of course, the system is rigged against the men in there, usually because they're the primary breadwinners, and that's where they're going to get their most money. Is it similar to that or different in France?
More different than similar. I mean, yeah, judges are gynocentric. The system is largely rigged against men, but in a different fashion than you would imagine. What you have to understand is that in a civil code country, the very concept of family court doesn't exist. There is the criminal court and the civil code, and that's it. There is no such thing as family court. The only aberration happened in Spain during the gender Stalinist regime, as now the history of Spain will know it. And by the way, this is a fact. I mean, nobody is denying that the period between 2004 and 2012 is essentially the gender Stalinist regime. Even the feminists acknowledge that. So yeah, the Spanish feminists, that is. The Argentinian feminists, they don't. Just look Cuando a Papa. Anyway. So yeah, except for that aberration, in civil code countries, there is only two types of courts: criminal court and civil court. In the civil court, the system has been made to be more adversarial than it used to be in the past, no doubt about it. But it's still not as business-like or as oriented towards ripping apart everything that's been within that household or within that marriage as it is the case in the common law countries or in the English-speaking countries. However, there is one particular feature that exists solely in France. I haven't been able to find it existing anywhere else in the world, which is to say that paternity tests are largely banned. So essentially, to get a paternity test as a man and get away with it in France is let's say that is something that is almost impossible. It's not entirely impossible, but it's almost impossible. It is as possible as it was to get legal contraceptives during Ceausescu's Romania. So it was technically possible, but largely impossible for most people.
How did this come to be, Lucian, that there was such a government push against paternity testing?
Yes, paternity testing, well, there are several hypotheses as to why this thing still exists today. In France, my favorite hypothesis is that essentially the whole marriage counseling, family care system, and the system in France is way bigger and wealthier than it is in the United States because, well, it's a socialist-oriented country. So essentially, the system in there has been infiltrated with huge amounts of psychologists and whatnot who believe that essentially parenthood is a social construct. So being a father, seriously, I'm not joking.
Fatherhood. I'm sorry, but I mean, the facepalm urge just took over.
Yes, I know it's laughable, but it's true, at least when it comes to the psychologists who rule the system in there. They believe that parenthood is essentially a social construct. So essentially, if you as a man have been into the child's life for, I don't know, let's say 10 years, and then you notice that, wait a minute, as the child grows up, he doesn't resemble me. Am I sure that this is really my kid? Well, that's illegal to find out. As many fathers who've been the victims of paternity fraud are now coming to find out in France. That's illegal to find out. So therefore, the laboratories who do paternity tests in Spain and in Switzerland, especially those that have their offices very close to the French border, are now have been seeing for the last 5 or 6 years a huge influx of French customers because, well, the French state can't yet prosecute you for doing a paternity test in Switzerland, at least not in Switzerland. Switzerland is not in the EU, so good luck issuing an arrest warrant for me breaking the French law in Switzerland. So yeah. But
so this is not something out of any misguided call for chivalry, which sort of guides the statutes here. This is really just ideological fervor behind the idea that parenthood is a social construct, and that father is really a matter of circumstance, where you happen to be at the time.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if this ban. I don't know, and I have to admit I don't know how this ban was first introduced. Because, mind you, this is not a new thing. This ban has been in place for at least 20 years, probably more. But it was mostly ignored. What I do know is that when I wrote the story, France upholds paternity test ban, which you can find on thevoiceformen.com. When I wrote that column, I wrote it because eventually someone tried to get the government to get rid of that ban, and the government said no. The François Hollande government said no, that thing stays in there. And I looked on the arguments that the powers that be presented to support their decision, and their arguments were almost all along these lines. Well, fatherhood is really a social construct anyway, so what's the problem if he's not a biological kid? Well, you've been in his life for 10 years. You are his father, period. This is the line of thinking that guides that. It's not necessary. It is gynocentric by proxy or by coincidence. The thrust of the matter is ideological leaning of everything is a social construct. There's no such thing as natural law. There is no such thing as natural inclinations to care more about your biological offspring as opposed to the offspring of someone else. Things like these or anything actually that comes from sociobiology, are largely rejected.
Well, yeah, of course, gravity is a social construct.
I haven't yet heard
Centrifugal
that.
force.
I haven't yet heard
You
that,
will.
but I wouldn't be surprised if someone will ever come up with such a theory. It would probably be a Frenchman.
Well, I tell you what, if there ever comes a time when cash flow is somehow connected to gravity, it will become a social construct pretty quickly in most countries. Um, let's move on a little bit, Lucian. Again, more to French culture, the relationships between men and women. Um, what are the standards there? Now, I know that we still have in place in the United States, even though a lot of Americans would deny this, but this is still a very chivalric country. Men are supposed to pay for women. Men are supposed to treat women like princesses. Men are supposed to defer to women and to give them what they want in order to make them happy. Is there a similar set of rules in French culture?
Yes, it is a similar, not an identical, but a similar set of rules. Yes, it exists. Now, the only difference is that, unlike the English-speaking nations, women reciprocate. Most women, including the younger ones, not only they appreciate such contract, but they uphold usually their part as well. That's why, for instance, you'll hear far less about false rape allegations in France. They happen, but they don't happen that often as they do in more entitled cultures. And that is partly because, well, as I said, the sexual promiscuity is not really so frowned upon in France. Is largely meh, so what? That's the main treatment that sexual promiscuity gets in France, and that's one of the reasons. And the second reason is that most women actually do uphold their part when it comes to the chivalric contract. So essentially, this man has been nice to me, and I voluntarily went up to his house, and we had a nice dinner, and then we had a nice fucking, and then we had some wine, and then some more fucking, and then when we finally woke up next day, well, actually, when I think about it better, maybe I shouldn't have gone to his house. But at the end of the day, he didn't force me, and he's been nice to me. So, well, tough luck. I'm gonna try to have nobody will find out that I've been here, so I'm now out. That's essentially the treatment, as opposed to the English-speaking nations, where the treatment is I'm gonna go and claim rape.
Yeah. Oh,
so,
yes.
so in this regard, there is a significant difference. Now, obviously, there are variations. What I said doesn't universally apply, but it is more common than the claim rape route.
Okay, let's talk for a moment about uh, incidents of divorce. Do marriages last in France? And again, I know you've broken down that there is the interpretation of civil law versus the marital contract. But when it comes to longevity of relationships there, nuclear families, two parents with children, that sort of thing, is that on the decline in France the way it is in so many other countries as well?
It is on the decline, but on a far slower pace than it is. I don't know. Let's compare it with Britain at a significantly slower pace. The ironical part is that when you say this to Frenchmen and say, "Look, your family is on the decline," admittedly at a far slower pace than Britain or Germany or whatnot. But the reason your family is on the decline is your huge state. They're going to be very offended by that. What do you mean with the state? Well, recently, and by recently I mean 6 months ago, something like that, the Francois Hollande government proposed a new tax code, which was largely accepted by the Great National Assembly, that is the French Parliament. which essentially incentivizes that you didn't used to be the case in the past, but now incentivizes uh, the the stay-at-home parent to go work even more and put the kids even earlier through the institutions. Now, mind you, even though French is a very government-oriented country, which is totally the opposite as the United States is, even though that's the case, most kids wouldn't go through a government institution before the age of 7, which is very late by Euro standards. I mean, I've been through a government institution since the age of 3. And now, admittedly, that was back in the communist era, but still, uh, this is now usually the case in Germany. Kids go through government institution since the age of 4. That's the average. There are kids who go even earlier. But in France, the average was kept around 7 years, which was essentially a landmark of why the French family has been roughly more stable than it was in other European countries. Whether we talk East or West doesn't really matter in this. But recently, I said this tax code essentially tried to to stimulate the stay-at-home parent, usually the mother, but not always, to go and work even more outside, and essentially penalized with the families that choose to have a stay-at-home parent get a rougher deal when it comes to their tax returns at the end of the fiscal year. And that is bound to have an effect of accelerating the decline of family, essentially to caught up with Britain, which I don't think it is a good idea. But well, who am I to question the judge of the dear socialist leader of France? So yeah, it is on the decline, but not yet as harsh as in other nations.
Well, I just have to point out and notice that earlier in our discussion here that you pointed out that, really, really radicalized mainstream for America and Canada feminist ideology has not penetrated the culture as much as it has in other places. And lo and behold, the decline of the French family is slower. I'm sure those two things are not possibly related.
Think about it like this. You would never see such stupidity as the one displayed by, what's that socialist name? Jessica Valenti. You would never see Jessica Valenti published in a French newspaper, at least not in a big mainstream one. Never. That's not going to happen. Such drivel would most likely will never occur. I can't think of opening Le Figaro in the morning and see the editorial of Jessica Valenti. That just doesn't cross my mind. It can't happen, at least not yet. So yeah, I mean, harsh, radical, Marxist, feminist rhetoric is still frowned upon in the media. I mean, look at it this way. 1 year ago, or actually less than 1 year ago, in June last year, I was reading an editorial published, I think it was in Le Monde, about the state of education in France, and was written by a Polish-French woman who's an expert on French education and has been an expert for like 40 years. And it was essentially full of the right points. I mean, essentially said, look, we've been dumbing down our education. We've been working hard to have the family less stable. And despite the fact that we've put kids earlier through government institutions as opposed to in the past, yet today a third grader of today is significantly dumber than a third grader in the 70s, and things like that. I wouldn't expect to see such thing published on the front page of New York Times, for instance. Right. I just wouldn't. But in France, these kinds of things are still not just allowed, but allowed on right up there in the biggest public forum, which is, I think it's a positive at the end of the day.
Yeah, being able to print the truth in full view of your readership does tend to, I think, help improve things. We seem to have a really bad problem with that in the United States. What passes for news here is quite an embarrassment, actually.
Yes, but let me add something to that. So
Sure.
whilst the truth about the state of education gets printed and appreciated in the French media, that doesn't mean that this consideration applies universally. For instance, try looking about how paternity tests are banned in France. Try looking about that in the mainstream media. You'll find it nowhere. There is nowhere. I mean, look at the column that I wrote for A Voice for Men over 2 years ago, and you will see comments there from the Frenchmen who say, I had to come to an American website to find out that paternity tests are banned in my country. What the fuck is wrong with this?
That must have been really, really humiliating for your average French.
I guess, but at the end of the day, you will only find that if you know what law to look for, and you'll find it in the law. But that's it. You'll never find it in the mainstream media, or even in the second-tier media. You'll probably find it on some random blogs, and ironically, some of them cite my column as a source, which is an embarrassment. I mean, some of the things just simply don't get printed. This is one of the things. Another thing was, I think it was Le Monde, the tech portion of the Le Monde, who attacked the Voice for Men and called us masculinists, which was admittedly quite funny. And yeah, and essentially it was all the talking points you would find in the Huffington Post, just translated into French, and printed out there. So whilst the French media is more open to some of the things that we would generally consider as the truth, is still not as it used to be.
Yeah, let me clarify for people that are watching too, just to make sure everybody knows. ABFM is not a masculinist site by any stretch of the imagination. We don't. You would have. You might find the word used in articles that are 5 or 6 years old a couple of times, but we make it very much a point that this is a non-ideological operation and publication. I won't identify as a masculist or a masculinist, either one. That implies ideology to me. It implies a set of expectations and beliefs that can't waver in the face of evidence. And so, as we're pointing that out to be a really big problem with feminist ideologues, Marxists, and others, we don't want to go down the path of having to subscribe to and then consequently support a set of beliefs down the road, no matter what the evidence may come to pass that what we believe is not true. So anybody who came to the site and said we're a bunch of masculinists, there are masculinists out there. They're just not part of the culture at ABFM. So people should know that. It's why we send back articles all the time on it.
Yes, but you know, it's this thing, and this probably quite universal in almost all mainstream European publications that I know of. It's this thing that if you're an anti-feminist, then you must be part of some counter ideology. And it's very hard to get this point across. Look, I don't subscribe to masculinism or some other ideology that is essentially mirroring feminism in some way, shape, or form. No, I'm just a non-feminist. I just believe you're full of shit, and that's it.
Yes, guess what? I don't have to have an alternative. I know that domestic violence, for instance, is really evidenced most accurately across the world in terms of gender symmetry. That is what the research shows. That's what the data that we have on it shows. That doesn't mean that I want the Violence Against Men Act. That doesn't mean that I want to start identifying men as the new victim class and then start raising money to address the poor male victims of domestic violence. What I want to do is say that this gendered model that paints women strictly in terms of being victims and men strictly in terms of being perpetrators, and that pulls on the heartstrings of average decent people who would like to protect women in order to get at their wallets, is bullshit. You don't have to have an ideology to counter that. All you have to do is have a little bit of the truth. And that is hard in this highly polarized world that is basically expressed through media across the planet in terms of ideology. It's hard. You lose people when you don't give them an ideology that provides them an alternative, because the idea of free thought, of being pragmatic with your approach to problems, has become alien to people all across the planet. They need something, some guideline that they can grab a hold of and say, okay, now I'm going to let this make sense to me. Sorry, but life is not that simple.
Yeah, life is a bit more complicated, just like with the thing of, when we routinely, either on A Voice for Men or on other non-feminist publications, there's routine publications of things like, well, women weren't oppressed throughout the history. Here's some evidence that they weren't oppressed. Here's a woman bashing men in the 16th century. Here's a woman founding the first modern university in the 9th century. Here's a woman doing this. If they were really oppressed, how oppressed could they be if they were founding countries, universities, and whatnot in the most horrible centuries for the history of mankind? But and all our philosophical opponents here is, oh, so you're saying there was no oppression of women anywhere, never. No, I'm saying that things are a bit more nuanced than you're putting it. That's all I'm saying.
And that's precisely where you lose them.
Yep.
Just like we watched with Cenk of Young Turks, his interview with Karen Strawn. The moment she introduced a nuanced concept, the understanding of voting rights, and understanding of voter rights that were just not that simple. It was a constantly evolving, changing process that included some people, excluded others. Yes, women were excluded by and large for a long time. So were men by and large for a long time. And still, all of men, in my country where I live right now, if I had not registered for selective service, I would have lost my right to vote. And I was of age during the draft years, where I could have been drafted and forced into military service, and that was my price for voting. Women have no such similar onus or expectation placed on them for that right, and that is, according to our 14th Amendment of our Constitution, that's a direct violation of constitutional law to have that system. And so the voting picture is muddled. It's not that clear. You have to understand different facts, and you could watch Cenk in that interview just mentally deteriorate as she talked. The dissonance grew until I thought that his head was going to explode, because he was hearing facts that were like, wait a minute, I cannot fit this into a nice ABC little format and deliver it in sound bites, so please shut up. That's what I saw.
It's safe to say that Cenk Uygur there just essentially went full Macintosh, which is to be expected. I mean, people hate me when I say this, but I expect such things to happen when it comes to ideologues, especially ideologues such as Cenk Uygur, who also practice some other cognitive dissonances, such as the denial of the Armenian Holocaust, whilst his show is called using the name of an elite extermination squad during that Holocaust. I mean, think about it like this. The Young Turks is essentially like having a show called the Gestapo, whilst being busy denying the Jewish Holocaust. That's essentially the Young Turks. So I could see that coming. Now, admittedly, him going full Macintosh was something of a gem. I enjoyed that and watched it multiple times because it was just plain funny.
Yes, and I will give them credit. They left it up there apparently for in perpetuity, which is just so now, like once every few months, if I get in a really sort of blue mood and I'm not feeling good and I'm kind of funky, I can go back and watch that interview and it'll pick my spirits up again. There's nothing I like watching more than that guy's head explode.
Yeah, and to their credit, they didn't pull a Sarkeesian either. They left the comment section open and the ratings open, which is
where they got slaughtered.
Well, you have to expect that. So yeah, with that, I think we're going. Yeah, we've been almost.
Yeah, we've been on for a while. Let me just get in. A couple of things here. Want to remind everybody, April 2nd, tickets will go on sale for the second annual International Conference on Men's Issues. We are working hard to both try to persuade and to figure out the financing to get Lucian to come there. We would like him to be a part of things. Yeah, I know he's shaking his head, but we're still going to work on him. We'll use shame, whatever it does. We'll come out with whatever guilt trip we have to, and make fun of him, thumb our nose, maybe we'll pull in J. Todd to help us convince him with that.
Okay, that was nasty.
Yeah, that was totally uncalled for, and I give you a public apology for that. But anyway, tickets will go on sale April 2nd. Lucian, as always, just listening to you talk is an education. I feel really glad that I get to do this series of shows with you, because each one I learn a lot about each country we're talking about. And one of the objectives that we have at A Voice for Men is that we want this to take on more and more, which it is happening. And this is an international movement. It doesn't just involve Americans, or just Americans and Canadians, or just Americans, Canadians, and Brits in Australia. There are people across the planet experiencing the negative impact of gender politics as they're practiced today, and we all have a lot of differences that we need to learn about, but each time we find there's a lot of similarities there that bring us together, and it's why I think this is happening in this way. So any other closing thoughts before we go, Lucian?
Yeah, about that objective, we need an AVFM France, or better said, an AVFM en français. So if you're out there and speak French, and most importantly, you can spell decently in French, because I know from experience spelling decently in French is quite an issue. Please try to contact me. You'll find my email on the masthead, on the About Masthead section on avoiceformen.com. Please contact me, and let's start working on an AVFM en français. Now, the project of the website already exists. You will be able to find it if I point you in the right direction. I won't announce it publicly because it looks like crap at this point. But essentially, yes, we need an AVFM en français out there, because French is one of the big languages of this planet, and we need a version of the website in French. So if you're out there, please contact me, and let's get this rolling. Now, this is an episode about France, but this whole, I'm going to try to make it a habit to put it every single show, at the end of every single show. We need more people to contribute to the Italian version of the website, to the Spanish version of the website. So yeah, if you're out there and you're thinking you have something to add, or at least you want to translate, you would like to see a big article on avoiceformen.com available in your native language, just drop me an email and let's get this thing happening.
Absolutely, and French would be language number 9. Lucian has just about single-handedly created an international networks of sites, of AVFM affiliates across the world. Won't be complete without several more languages. French is certainly one of them. So by all means, come to the masthead at AVFM. Find the contact info for Lucian under our masthead, and give the guy an email, and let's get rolling on that. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody and say we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks with another country. And just remember one thing, folks. Countries are a social construct. We live in the world without borders. Oh, wait a minute. No, I was giving into my feminist side there. Folks, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
See ya.